Okay, today's daf we're going to be learning is Pesachim, daf tzadi tet. It's a very exciting daf because we are finally getting to our Pesachim, our last chapter of Masechet Pesachim, which means our siyum is in sight in a few weeks. Bezrat Hashem, we're going to do it on the 21st of March on a Sunday. Sundays, we actually finish on Monday. We'll do it on Sunday as it's a good day for people all around the world. So 8:30 p.m. Israel time, the usual time, and wherever that is, wherever you are. So put it down in your calendars. We have a good program. We'll come out with it in a few days. The next thing is our dedications for today. Today's daf is sponsored by Daniel and Eva Schweber in loving memory of their father, Ken Schweber, who are learning daf Yomi in honor of his own Talmud studies. And by Amy Goldstein in memory of her mother, Carolyn Barnett Goldstein, in honor of her second yahrzeit. We miss her artistic spirit, wealth of knowledge, and joy for life. Okay, this is, by the way, a really good time if you have friends who are interested in maybe trying out daf Yomi to tell them to try the 10th parak of Pesachim because it works out amazing. It's always fun when this happens, that it really corresponds. Our Pesachim is all about the customs of Pesach night, of what we do on Pesach, right? We're finishing all the sacrifices. We'll finish at the beginning of today's daf and moving into what we actually do Seder night, how our Haggadah developed. It's very interesting. Those who are taking the skills course, it'll be great because you've been learning this and now we're going to breeze through it, not at the exact same pace that we've been doing in the skills class. For those who haven't yet joined the skills class, by the way, there's still 3 more classes left. You can join. You don't have to have done the previous ones in order to come. So it's Monday evenings at 8:30 p.m. Israel time. And it's also available online. So if you'd like to do it on your own time and catch up before the Seder, or even just to learn a few topics and see them in depth, so you come to the Seder prepared with knowledge and information, highly recommended. It's a free course. You just have to register for the site and you can access all the materials. Okay, with that, we will get started. It's actually a very short daf. So here goes. We started yesterday, we had this Mishnah, and the Mishnah discussed, basically it was a very, very long Mishnah that had 2 basic parts to it. And we're going to discuss very briefly each of those parts. So the first section was a case where they have an animal designated for the sacrifice and the animal gets lost. And then the group that was originally together splits up. One person goes in search for the Korban Pesach, and the rest of them go and say, we're going to try to buy a new animal. So there were different scenarios where one said to the other, listen, include me in yours. Because at this point, they've broken up. And when they find a new animal, right, or even if they find the old animal, they're not necessarily together anymore. It all depends on what they say. So one of the cases was, which is what the Breita, we're going to start with the Breita now, at the very bottom of Tzadik Chedem Bet, Tanu Rabbanit, Amar Lahen v'amru lo. Okay, they say it very short, but the whole situation is what we learned yesterday, which is, if he says to them, please include me. If you go buy a new animal, please include me when you slaughter it. And ve'amru lo, and they say to him, if you find the original animal, include us when you slaughter it. Then what's the law? Ochel min harishon, right? So then they only can eat the meat of the one that was slaughtered first. So in a situation where in the end they all get together and they find out which was slaughtered first, that's very easy. And then they each eat, whichever one was slaughtered first, they eat together because they each asked to be included in the other, and therefore they're included in the other's sacrifice. But if we don't know which was slaughtered first, or they were slaughtered at exactly the same time, then we're stuck. Because then if we don't know, or there was no one that was first, we end up with one of the Pesachim ended up without any people registered for it because everyone had already fulfilled their obligation, and that disqualifies it. In which case we end up with a problem because we don't know which one is disqualified. So we saw in the Mishnah that what's the law? Okay, they don't even tell you this in the Breita, even though this is really important for the purpose of the Breita. You'll see why in a minute. In this case, both have to be burned. And because we don't know which one is actually the correct one, both have to be burned. And therefore nobody gets to eat it. However, they're exempt from Pesach Sheni. So they end up in a really bad situation because nobody can actually eat their Korban Pesach. Happens, you fulfilled your obligation, but that's not great because you're not really, right? You get to the Seder and there's no Pesach to eat. It's kind of disappointing. So that's the first case. Lo amar lahem v'lo amru lo. Now let's say they split. I go to look for the animal and you all go find a different animal and we don't say anything. We just split up. Now what will happen? if I find my animal and you buy a new animal, so I slaughter mine, you slaughter yours, and Shalom Yisrael, right? This is great. So, einam achrayin ze lezeh, right? If that's the case, then no one's responsible for anyone else. There's no confusion here. I find my animal, I slaughter it. You find yours, right? You buy one, you slaughter it. Now, obviously, we're going to see there is a bit of a problem with this scenario, but we'll get to it in a minute. But right now, the Braita assumes that that's a much better situation. Why? Because we're not going to end up burning any sacrifices. We don't want to burn, right? We learned you don't want to bring kodashim lebeit hasreifa, right? Let's say it's safek shlamim, safek pesach, and then it's going to end up, if you leave over meat, you're going to have to burn it, and maybe it was only a shlamim, and it really only needs to be burnt the following day. And we don't like to burn sacrificial meat if we don't have to, and you never get to eat your meat, which is a really bad situation. So here comes the rabbis in their typical rabbinic way, where they like to say, we're going to teach you a lesson from this whole thing. What can we learn from this? From here, the rabbis said, this is all part of the Braita. Yafesh tikala chachamim kal v'chomer l'tipshim. Very interesting line, right? Better to keep your mouth shut, right? This is classic if you go to a shiva house, right? Often people say the wrong things, right? They're uncomfortable and they don't know what to say, and they say something and end up offending someone, right? Sometimes you're much better off being silent than saying things. Silence is better. And in this case, silence is better. Why? Because if you were just silent about it, then I would have been Yossi with my animal and you would have been Yossi with yours. And everything would have been very nice. We all would have had our korban Pesach and we would have sat that night to eat it. Maybe I would have eaten mine alone, but at least I had one to eat, better than in the other situation where we have to burn it. And then they bring a pasuk in Mishlei to prove it. Shene'emar, evil mecharish chacham yechashev. If you have a foolish person who's silent, he will be considered a wise person. Okay. Sometimes, right, people don't, if you open your mouth, if you have foolish things to say, you'll look like a fool. But if you keep your mouth shut, right, I've been in this situation many times where I look at the situation after and I say, totally shouldn't have said anything, right? Had I just kept my mouth shut, sometimes you just say things, they come out and they make you look a little bit foolish. So there's a few interesting things about this. First of all, there's a big question, which is, it's not necessarily the best way to go in this situation. Why? Because the situation described in the Mishnah was where I actually found the original animal and you actually managed to buy an animal. But let's say you can't find an animal to buy. Think about Erev Pesach. Everybody's buying animals. Maybe there's none left. Or I don't find my original animal. Then if I hadn't said anything to you, I'd end up without a korban at all. That's not a good situation, right? Or you might end up without. So it's not necessarily so perfect here that it's better to keep silent. So the best answer to that question is, this was just the rabbi's way to remember this concept, remember this idea that better to keep your mouth shut sometimes. How do we learn it? From this situation that here it caused something bad to happen, that we had to burn sacrifices. And it's just a way of remembering this concept that better to be quiet, right? Even though it's not really directly learned out from here. It's kind of like saying asmachta ba'alma, the way we say the pasuk didn't really mean that, but we can connect it to the pasuk, and that's how people will remember as a mnemonic device. That's one way of reading it. The tzlach actually answers that question by saying it's worse to this situation where you can't fix it. You can't bring up korban Pesach Sheni and you end up without any meat. Because if you just end up not finding your animal, at least you can make it a Pesach Sheni. In this situation, you don't get a second chance. The other thing I thought of was that also we burn sacrificial meat, which is the worst, right? That's very severe. We don't want to come to a situation where we have to burn sanctified items. So that's another possibility. But again, I think that it wasn't necessarily learned directly from here. It's just a way that they connected here so that you remember this concept of better to not open your mouth sometimes. And, you might be considered wise. The other interesting thing about this is our lead into Arvei Pesachim, which now the four sons, we all know from the Haggadah. There's the Chacham, the Rasha, right, the wise, the Rasha, the evil, the Tam, the simple one, and the Sheino Yodea Lishol. Now, they don't appear in our Gemara, actually, but they do appear in the Mechilta, which is Midrash Halacha, which is from the Mishnah time period. And this, in my mind, is a reference to that, because I can't remember now, it also appears in the Mechilta, it also appears in the Yerushalmi, I forget which version, but one of the versions, I think it's the Mechilta, has the Tam, not as the Tam, the simple son, as the Tipesh, as the stupid son, however you would call it. So, right, it's always a word I don't like to use, but it's interesting that here they talk about the Chacham and the Tipesh as if it's almost this lead in to the fact that we're about to talk about children and different types of children and different types of people that we need to teach the story to and in different manners. And maybe it's also a bit of a lead into the next chapter. Okay, with that, we're going to move on. The next section of the Mishnah, after we got through all the cases of the different permutations of who said what to who about this lost animal, then we got to a case where our Pesachim got mixed up, okay? My animal got mixed up with yours. I designate an animal, you designate an animal. I think I forgot to mention this, but this is all, by the way, before slaughtering the animal. Once the animal is slaughtered, whoever was manoi is manoi. You can't start changing. But we're talking about before you slaughter the animal, if the animals get mixed up, right? I designated mine, you designated yours. They got mixed up. What happens? Okay, now we're going to talk about specifically Shnayim Shenitavu Pesachim. We're only two people. And I take one and you take one. And then what has to happen? I have to bring someone else from the shuk, right? I go find a random person. I say, come join my Pesach. You bring someone else to come join your Pesach. And then I go with you and then you go with me. And we stipulate and we say, listen, if this is your pet, right? If the one that, like, I go to your group and I say, listen, if the animal here was yours originally, then I'm joining your group. And then I'm leaving the person from the shuk on my original one. And you have to, because you can't leave a Pesach without someone on it, right? Otherwise it will be disqualified. And then you come to, but if not, if it's mine, then you're joining my group. Okay. So we basically do it like that. And we have to bring someone else from the shuk. So the Gemara says, and I want you to remember this structure because it's going to try to say, there's a machloket Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda. And it's going to say, wait a minute, is our Mishnah really not matching Rabbi Yehuda's opinion and only Rabbi Yossi? I want you to remember this because the first Mishnah, the first Gemara on the Mishnah in the next side of the page is also going to be an attempt to say maybe the Mishnah is only Rabbi Yossi and not Rabbi Yehuda. So it's the same thing, totally different topic, but it's interesting that it's the same idea here. So Lema Manita Deloka Rabbi Yehuda. Maybe our Mishnah doesn't hold like Rabbi Yehuda. Why is that? Titania, it says in a Braita, we've seen this verse a few times. If you can't find an animal, so what do? You join your neighbor, right? But there's an interesting language. It says, the house becomes less, that it doesn't have an animal. Why does it say that? It means that you can start off with 10 people. I'm just giving a random number. And you can go down as much as you want. You can start with 10 people as long as before you slaughter it, right? You've got your right amount of people. But you can, those 8 of them, 9 of them can go leave your animal if they want and go switch and go to a different group. But one of the original chabura, let's say 10 of us got together and took an animal and then 9 of us left, as long as one is left. If all 10 leave, even if we bring other people in, that doesn't work. You have to have from the original 10 or the original 2 or whatever it might be. So now what's the problem here? Right, so let's just move on, finish to the end of the Braita. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Rabbi Yossi says it doesn't matter who's left. As long as someone's left, it's fine. Now, take our case. I had a Pesach, you had a Pesach. The animal, right, I had an animal, you had an animal. Our animals got mixed up. I now brought someone else in. He wasn't part of the original group. He's new. And now I leave and I go to you. And theoretically, I leave my Pesach alone with just that person. And I say, if that's my Pesach, right? If that's your Pesach, then I'm joining you. And if it's my Pesach, then you're joining me, right? And basically, that doesn't seem to work according to Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda says you have to have the original person there. So the Gemara is saying as a question, is our Mishnah really not matching Rabbi Yehuda's opinion? So Amar Rabbi Yochanan, he comes and answers and says, no, afilu tema Rabbi Yehuda. I can explain the Mishnah even according to Rabbi Yehuda. Why? Because there's something else Rabbi Yehuda says, and you have to factor that in. Rabbi Yehuda also says, if you remember, we learned this, that you can't have the Pesach done, right? Remember, me'achad sha'arecha, where even one person, right? It can't be done with only one person. So because of that, but now, what happened in this case? I had an animal and you had an animal. Both of them only have one person. Now, if you're Rabbi Yehuda and you say you can't do that, then what had to have happened in any case? I had to bring someone else from the shuk, right? I had to go find someone to join my Pesach, otherwise it wouldn't have been valid in the first place. So because of that, me'ikara, from the beginning, I had to add someone else to my Pesach, which means that when now we say I have to leave someone for the original group has to be at least 2. So it's true that when I designated the animal, he wasn't part of the original group, but it wasn't anything at that point because I can't bring it by myself, according to Rabbi Yehuda. So specifically, according to Rabbi Yehuda, I need to bring someone else. So when I brought someone from the shuk, he was considered he was considered one of the original members of the group. Because if you need two, then the second one is obviously, even if I brought him in later, he's the main person in the group now, from the original group. So therefore, the Mishnah could work with Rabbi Yehuda because, again, I am leaving someone from the original group, and therefore it's okay. Obviously, the problem is you'd have to add someone else, according to Rabbi Yehuda, because you'd end up, that person would be the sacrifice all by himself. Right? They don't really address that issue. Amar Rav Ashi, matniti nani daikem. Rav Ashi is going to prove it further from the language of the Mishnah, the Katane, as it says. I tried to chart this out on the sheet, okay? If you assume, right, each group, let's say you have 5 groups, according to the Mishnah, it said, and if you have 5 groups of 5, or 10 of 10, or maybe 5 groups with 10 in them, there's 2 different ways to read that Mishnah, but that line in the Mishnah, but what does he say? The main point is, if you have chabulot shel chamisha chamisha, which seems to imply, shel chamisha in, aval shel chamisha va'arba'a lo. Sounds like you have to have 5 groups of 5 people each. Why? So again, let's just assume, and this I put on the sheet, you can look. Let's say group number 1 is 5 number 1s. Group number 2 is 5 number 2s. Group number 3 is 5 number 3s. Group number 4, 5, right? Okay, and so on. If we have 5 in each group, then what happens? Each person from each group, right? One person from every group goes into another group. So you're going to end up with 5 groups, and instead of being 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, and 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, you're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in every single group. But that only works if you end up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in every single group, because according to Rabbi Yehuda, you need one of the original ones. But if you had, therefore they say here, it sounds like shel chamisha va'arba'a lo. But if you had 4 groups of 5 and one group only had 4 in them, so it only had 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, when you split 1, 2, 3, 4, you're going to end up, one group is not going to have a number 5 in it. And if their animal happened to be the animal of group number 5, you're going to end up stuck. According to Rabbi Yehuda, that's not going to work. And that's exactly why the Mishnah gave this example of 5 groups of 5 each, because if it had 4, it wouldn't work. And that would only be according to Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yossi said, as long as someone's in that group, this group has a person from group 1, a person from group 2, a person from group 3, a person from group 4. So even if it was the animal of group 5, according to Rabbi Yossi, that would be fine. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, that wouldn't work. And therefore, he proves that the Mishnah really is like Rabbi Yehuda. And then, right, he explains here, is it not because the reason why 4 wouldn't work is because you'll end up with nobody from group 5. And if it happens to be that was the animal from Chabura number 5, that wouldn't work. Shma mina, one can infer this from here. And with this, hadranach mishayat tamei. And if you remember the way we ended the 4th parak, we said slika la Pesach Rishon, and now we have slika la Pesach Sheni. And with that, we finish Pesach Sheni. If you remember, we said that the Masechet was split up into 2 groups, Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni, even though the information in the first 4 chapters was not Pesach Rishon. Pesach Rishon sounds like the first Pesach sacrifice. Really, right? Everything about sacrifices was in chapters 5 to 9, both Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni, but yet, for whatever reason, they call it Pesach Rishon. Maybe it's a little bit of a play on words. And even stranger than that is that they call it Pesach Rishon, but at the end, and I just want to spend a brief minute talking about this, at the end of Daf Nun Zayin Amud Bet, we finished. It said Hadran Lach Makom Shenagu. Right, we finished chapter Makom Shenagu Uslik Ala Pesach Rishon, and with that we finished Pesach Rishon, the whole section. And then there's this in our printed edition. Now this was not in every printed edition of the Gemara. It seems to have started in an edition in Amsterdam much later, not like in the time even from the Middle Ages, but later, like in the maybe a few hundred years ago. There's this Seder Hilchot Korban Pesach B'Ktsara, Pesach Rishon B'Ktsara, and here we have Piskei Hilchot Pesach Sheni B'Ktsara. So it's strange that at the end of chapter 4, they put this brief of Pesach Rishon halachot, and here we do a brief of Pesach Sheni halachot. Again, you would have assumed we'd have the brief of Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni halachot at the end of these 5 chapters where we just discussed Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni. It's a little bit strange that they put the summary of the halachot of Pesach Rishon at the end of chapter 4. We haven't even talked yet about the sacrifice, but in any case, this is there. We don't really know where this comes from. We don't even know who wrote it. Some people think it's Tosfot. Some people think it's someone who did a summary of the Rambam, of the Hilchot of the Rambam, but nobody really knows who's the author of this section, as far as I could tell. Okay, with that, we're done with our section. We're now moving on to Perek Arvei Pesachim. So Erev Pesachim, now it's called Perek Arvei Pesachim, but if you notice, the first word is Erev Pesachim, and there's already a debate about whether it's Erev or Arvei. There's different versions of the text. What's the difference? So Arvei Pesachim would mean Arvei Pesachim year after year. Okay, that would make sense to say, right? We're talking about why is Pesachim in plural? Because it means all the Arvei Pesachim that we have from year to year. If you say Erev Pesachim, it sounds strange. It should be either Arvei Pesachim, the whole thing is plural, or Erev Pesach, the afternoon, right? Erev, we mean the afternoon. This is, by the way, a very similar structure of today's stuff to the way we started the 4th chapter. If you remember, if you look back for a quick minute, in the 4th chapter, we started off with, let me just open it, on Daf Nun, it's Nun, yeah, Daf Nun. Makom shna'aku la'asot malacha ba'arvei pesachim ad chatzot osim, right? And we start with this whole thing about not being able to do malacha, work on arvei pesachim. There, by the way, it says arvei pesachim, okay, which would make sense to say that our Mishnah really should be arvei pesachim, but you see here in our printed Gemara, it says erev pesachim. Toso gives 2 answers. He says, why does it say erev pesachim? Because it's a night, it's an afternoon, the shochatim bo pesachim. It's an afternoon that we slaughter many pesachim, as we learned already, right? That a lot of pesachim are slaughtered because everybody, right, each of the groups slaughter their own. Tosfot also says, Inami erev pesach rishon v'sheni. Maybe it's a reference to the fact that we have 2 pesachim going on here, okay? And then maybe this would be the same laws also for the eve before the afternoon in which we sacrifice Pesach Sheni, okay? And then it would make more sense the way the Gemara is going to read. A possible reason for this mission is that maybe it has to do with the korban and not with all the preparations. Right? We talked about our Erev Pesachim, if you remember, that we don't do work. Why don't we do work? So there were different explanations. Is it because we don't want to miss the korban, or because we have a lot of preparation to do on this day? And the same thing here, it's going to be, the issue here is going to be not eating. Now, why not eating? Because eating, you get distracted when you eat, okay? So I'll give you a great example. On Friday, I went to a perm student at my brother's house, and we went, early afternoon, because we're going to see today that you're not allowed to eat late in the day. It's perfect halacha 4. We should have learned it before Friday, about perm student eating at Friday afternoon. So we went, but we ended up getting home an hour before Shabbat. Now, while we were there, I was totally distracted, right? I wasn't thinking about, I have to get home and I had a nice relaxed meal, and it was very nice. And I wasn't thinking about all the things I had to do. And then, of course, I get home an hour before Shabbat, and it was a crazy hour, of course, because we were busy doing a million things. But you could easily get distracted. In fact, at a certain point, I said, I really think we should be getting home because, it's Shabbat soon. And you could see how you're in the middle of a meal and you get easily distracted and you don't deal with all the things you're supposed to be dealing with. So that's a lot of the concern here. That if you start eating a meal, you're going to get distracted and you're not going to end up doing what you're supposed to do. Or maybe it's this other issue, which we're going to see, about eating the matzah b'te'avon. You should go into your meal, right, hungry for the matzah. Or the Rashbam says it's hidur mitzvah. It's a better mitzvah if you're hungry and you really want to be eating the matzah rather than you're coming from a full meal. So, right, anyone who ate a big Suda and then wasn't hungry for Friday night dinner, right? It's a good example where you're not hungry when it comes time to eat this meal that's supposed to be a mitzvah, when it comes to Pesach. It's this important mitzvah of eating matzah. So anyway, with that, let's read the Mishnah. So, Erev Pesachim, samuch lemincha lo yochal adam ad shetachshach. So when it comes to the Arvei Pesachim or Erev Pesach, however you read it, before Mincha, okay, it has to be sometime before Mincha. What is Mincha? So it's going to be a question in the Gemara, do we mean Mincha Gedola, which is half an hour after midday, or do we mean Mincha Ktana, which is going to be 2.5 hours before the end of the day? Okay, so this is a good example of when you're not allowed to eat. So now, but it doesn't say Mincha, it says Samuch. Samuch means, they understand, a half an hour before. So either we're going to say 12 noon, or we're going to say about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, right? On a day that starts at 6 and ends at 6, which often around Pesach, that's the time of year we are, where depending on where you live, but often it's kind of this in-between time where the day really does, sun rises around 6 and sets around 6, so it's around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So lo yochal adam ad shetachshach, you cannot eat until dark. Now, big question, what can't you eat? Is it any food? Is it like a fast? You can't eat at all? Or you just can't sit down and eat a meal with bread? Okay, right? This is something we say about also on our Arvei Shabbatot. We're going to see you're not allowed to have a big meal close to the end of the day. Okay, so therefore, lo yochal adam ad shetachshach. So on Pesach, so Erev Pesach, samuch lemincha, you can't eat until it's dark. Afilu anisha b'Yisrael lo yochal ad sheyasev. Now we seem to be talking about a totally different topic. Even a poor person shouldn't eat until he reclines. Okay, so now we seem to be jumping to reclining, as if reclining we all know about it. The Mishnah assumes, just like when we say, in the first Mishnah of the Shas. says, from when do we read Shema at night? As if you know that we read Shema at night, right? How do you know that? So the assumption is, yeah, you knew that. Okay. Likewise, they assume you know that you need a recline. The chiddush here is even poor people need a recline. Now, there's a few questions. What's the connection to the previous line? Or maybe there is none. So some Tosfot wants to connect it and suggest that maybe some people read it as also a poor person can't eat. It's connected. It's not only you can't eat, but even a poor person who maybe doesn't have food for a few days also can't eat until it's time to recline. And then Ad She'aseh is not until he reclines, it's until the time of reclining. And then it's a little bit weird. Why didn't it just say Ad She'tachshach? Also a little bit strange, but maybe they wanted to teach you two halachot in one. Some people say this has nothing to do with eating. This is just about reclining. And the point is that even a poor person, Tosfot suggests maybe he doesn't have anything to recline on. He still needs to symbolically recline. He still needs to look like he's reclining, even though he doesn't have pillows, let's say, in his house to prop himself up on. Or, right, because the whole point is, and this is why the ani is included, a poor person is part of the Seder just as well. Just because he's poor and he doesn't have the means to do everything, we have to provide him with the means, or he has to symbolically do the actions to experience this whole thing that we're trying to experience of being released from slavery. So another possible reason, there's always a big question, why all of a sudden we're mentioning poor people? And one of the reasons is, and we're going to see this throughout, that a lot of the details of what they discuss and things like drinking wine and other things, a lot of the Seder and the way it was modeled, okay, the Seder developed really during the time period following the destruction of the temple. Right? When there was no longer a Korban Pesach, they needed something more ritual. This is like tefillot in general. And they were somewhat based on, with changes that suited our needs. And this is one of them. It was somewhat based on the Greco-Roman symposiums where they would have these lavish meals and they would recline. But what was the difference there? And they would philosophize and talk about things, right? Like Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim. But the main difference is they didn't include any poor people, right? It was just the elite of society. And we're saying, no, this is something that affects every single person. And therefore we have to be important and make sure to include the poor people. You have to make sure that the poor person gets 4 cups of wine, even minat tamchoy. There's a whole debate about what this means. Tamchoy is usually where they would give out 2 meals per person. Some people say he has to actually sell his food in order to get the wine, okay, even from the food he got from the tamchoy. And there's a debate here about who the ultimate responsibility. Is it on the people, the community, to make sure he gets it, or is it on him himself? Or maybe it's only on the poor person himself if the community doesn't provide for him. So there's a whole debate here about who exactly is responsible and who Yifachatulo is referring to. Is it referring to the poor person? Is referring to the community? Okay. Again, these are all things that, like in the skills class, we went much more in depth into all the answers to these questions. In Daf Yomi class, we don't have time, but I'm at least mentioning it. Now the Gemara starts off exactly the way it started off in the 4th chapter. So if you remember the 4th chapter, this beginning structure is very simple. They say, why did the Mishnah specifically say Arvei Pesachim? Why didn't it say also Erev Shabbat and also Erev Yom Tov? You might say, why would we have thought to say that when our topic is Pesach, right? We're not talking about Shabbat and Yom Tov. So Tosfot tries to answer that question. He says, well, the fact that you only say Pesach will make people think it's only Pesach, and you might cause people to mistakenly think that there's no problem to do this on Shabbat. I remember when I taught this in the skills class, I gave the example of my son. He comes home from the army on Friday afternoons, he's starving, and he starts eating late in the day a big meal with, washing all that bread, and it's explicitly against what we're going to read in a minute that you really can't do this. But if the idea is that you're just not supposed to be hungry, well then it's not such a big deal because he's so hungry from the army that it doesn't matter. He'll eat a huge meal at dinner also. It's not going to affect him. It's not going to make him any less hungry for dinner. So theoretically, one could say maybe then it's not as relevant, right? This isn't like a halacha from the Torah. This is right preventative. It's to prevent you either from being too full that you won't eat the matzah l'te'avon, and on Shabbat you won't enjoy your meal, right? Or possibly it's about preparations, and you won't. My son, luckily he's in the army, and I give him a break, and he helps out a little, but it's not like he has so many preparations to do for Shabbat. He won't be ready in time. So one could also maybe say it's a little less relevant. So anyway, it's a good question. Whether, you can say this just doesn't apply. Right? There's all sorts of times where we don't eat in halacha, and it's a kind of loose not eating, because it's really just so that you don't get distracted, right? Like the time for candle lighting comes for Hanukkah. You're not supposed to eat until you light candles, because otherwise you might get distracted and forget to light candles. So how seriously we take those, how serious is it in Isur, right? There's also some people say you shouldn't work then and you shouldn't eat then. Okay, there's all sorts of times where we say this. Anyway, so the Gemara asks, why does it specifically say Erev Pesachim? It should have also said Erev Shabbat and Yom Tov. How do we know? Tanya, because we're going to quote a Braita where it says explicitly that. Now, remember, I told you to pay attention on the first side of the page where we said maybe our Mishnah doesn't fit in with Rabbi Yehuda and it fits with Rabbi Yossi. So now we're going to see those same two characters in this Braita. Lo yochal adam ba'arvei Shabbatot v'yamim tovim min hamincha u'lamala kedei sheyikanes l'Shabbat kashu ta'ava. You shouldn't eat from mincha and on Erev Shabbat and on Erev Yom Tov, every Erev Chag and Shabbat, so that you go into Shabbat being hungry, because the mitzvah to oneg Shabbat. Okay, now one might distinguish between the mitzvah of oneg Shabbat and the mitzvah of eating matzah, because the mitzvah of eating matzah is d'oraita, and the mitzvah of eating a meal on Friday night is Rabbanit. It's learned out from a verse about oneg Shabbat. So one could make a distinction, but they say right now it seems like it's the same. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi Omer, ochel v'holech ad shetechshach. Rabbi Yossi says there's no problem. So the Gemara right now is just focusing on Rabbi Yehuda really and saying, according to Rabbi Yehuda, why wouldn't our Mishnah have mentioned not just Erev Pesach, but also Erev Shabbat and Erev Yom Tov? So the first answer is very simple. Amar Rav Huna, lo tzricha ela Rabbi Yossi. Our Mishnah, now why did they think our Mishnah was Rabbi Yehuda? Because Rabbi Yossi doesn't seem to think there's any sort of problem eating on Erev Chag. So therefore, we can assume he didn't think there was a problem eating on Erev Pesach, and therefore our Mishnah must match Rabbi Yehuda. If it matches Rabbi Yehuda, well then it should have mentioned also all the others and not just Erev Pesach. So Rav Huna says, no, our Mishnah is actually only according to Rabbi Yossi, which is like what we tried to suggest in the previous sugya, that maybe our Mishnah is only Rabbi Yossi and not Rabbi Yehuda. So he actually says it, right? There we rejected it. Here he's suggesting maybe that's it. And now why? In the case of Erev Shabbat and Erev Yom Tov, he thinks you can eat until dark. But that's only on Erev Shabbat and Erev Yom Tov. But Rabbi Yossi thinks Pesach is different, and that's why it only says Pesach, because it's only by Pesach. But on Erev Pesach, where there's a chiyuv matzah, maybe he would agree with Rabbi Yehuda. Then in this case, we're not going to let you eat in the afternoon. Okay, every other day you can, but not on Erev Pesach. So that's the first answer. The second answer is Rav Papa, who tries, like in the previous sugya, there they succeeded. We'll see here. Maybe he succeeds, maybe he doesn't. You'll have to wait till tomorrow to see that, which is Rav Papa tries to read our Mishnah also according to Rabbi Yehuda. Rav Papa Amar, afilu tema Rabbi Yehuda. I'm going to try to read our Mishnah according to Rabbi Yehuda. How so? Well, there's a difference between the two. If you paid attention to the Braita, careful attention, this is where you need careful textual reading. Hatam ba'arvei Shabbatot v'yamim tovim. There, when it talked about Erev Shabbat and Yom Tov, what did it say? Min hamincha u'lamala hu dasir. It said from mincha on. That means from mincha. What did our Mishnah say? Samuch lemincha, which we said was a half an hour before. So we're going to say min hamincha u'lamala hu dasir samuch lemincha shari. But there, from 3 o'clock, you're okay. It's only 3:30 that it's a problem. Aval be'erev Pesach afilu samuch lemincha nami asur. But Erev Pesach, even from 3, it's asur. Now, you might say, kind of minor difference, only half an hour, but it's still half an hour difference, and there's a difference, and therefore, our Mishnah was highlighting the one that starts even earlier, and it's to tell you, this Isser starts half an hour before the other one. By the way, I'm explaining this all that we're talking about mincha ktana, which is the later mincha. The Mishnah, the Gemara later, in a number of dapim, is going to question and say, do we mean mincha gedola, or do we mean mincha ktana? Okay, we'll get to that. Erev Shabbat, in the end, they're going to say mincha ktana, and that's why I'm going with that. So now they say, wait a minute. According to what you're saying, on Erev Shabbat and Erev Yom Tov, it's only forbidden from mincha and not from before mincha, which would mean 9.5 hours into the day, right? Which is 2.5 hours before the end of the day, which is the same as saying 3:30. Okay, but I'm specifically saying 9.5 hours into the day because we're going to bring a source that seems to contradict this. So now they say, afilu Erev Shabbat samuch lemincha shari. Is it really permitted on Erev Shabbat before mincha? That's half an hour before mincha you're allowed to eat, and only at 9.5 hours you can't? Can't possibly be. Vahatanya, because I'm going to bring you a Braita that says, doesn't start talking about it as mincha and samuch and all that. It gives you an actual time. And what time would you expect? You would expect 9.5, but that's not what it says. It actually says 9 here, which seems to go exactly opposite of what Rav Papa said. So here we have this other Braita. Lo yochal adam be'erev Shabbat v'yamim tovim mitesha sha'ot u'lamala. You can't do it from 9 hours on, so that you go into Shabbat being hungry. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. That's Rabbi Yehuda. So here you see he says 9 hours, which means it's exactly the same as our Mishnah, which means it doesn't make any sense, our Mishnah, to say it's Rabbi Yehuda because he should have included the other days. And then we're just finishing the Braita, Rabbi Yossi, and there Rabbi Yossi's opinion appears exactly the same. To which Amar Zutra, and here we're going to have a possible a possible answer to this. He says, you're raising a problem from this Braita. That's where you're getting your issue from. He says, who's to say that the Braita you're quoting is a good Braita? It's true someone brought this Braita, but maybe it's a mistake. And if you remember, this goes back to what we learned about Braitot in general. Braitot were passed down by word of mouth. People recited them. It's very possible that someone said 9 hours when it was really 9.5 hours. And it could be it's just a mistake and they got confused. And maybe they got confused because they thought it was the same as Pesach. And it could be it's just an incorrect Braita. And therefore, he says, don't bring a question against it from the Braita. So we're left at this point, and we'll have to see if we're left here at the same point tomorrow after we learn tomorrow's class. But right now, we have two possible answers to this question. Why didn't it mention Arvei Pesachim? One is to say it just doesn't, why didn't it mention Arvei Shabbatot also and Yom Tov? One is to say it's according to Rabbi Yossi and not according to Rabbi Yehuda at all. And the other is to say it even matches Rabbi Yehuda, and there's this half-hour difference, and that's why it didn't mention, because it's not the same laws exactly. To which we brought a Braita that seems to contradict, to which Mazurcha said, maybe it's a Braita with a mistake in it. Maybe the Braita is incorrect, and therefore we don't have to worry about that. Okay, with that, we're going to end today. I'm just going to quickly look at the questions because we have a little time. So I see that there was a question about this charity plate or the charity box. So a tamchoy, I'll tell you a little bit about the background of the tamchoy. The tamchoy literally means a utensil. It was a utensil that people filled up their food with. Okay, but it meant to be, it came to be used in general as the place where they gave out food for meals, and usually it was 2 meals a person a day. That was the average amount of meals people ate in a day. Therefore, people would get 2 meals a day from the tamchoy. Like there's a question: do you give 3 meals for Shabbat or not? Right? Or does the poor person just need to kind of split up his meals into 3? So anyway, that's just to explain what a tamchoy is. And I see there's a question about why did they conclude, right? It's an interesting thing because I kind of brought it up, and maybe I didn't really go to the end here, which is in the previous Mishnah, we explained the Mishnah according to Rabbi Yehuda. Here, we seem to be explaining the Mishnah according to Rabbi Yossi. In the end, we're going to see, right? We'll see whether we can also explain it according to Rabbi Yehuda. But what's similar about them is in both, there's an attempt to explain it according to Rabbi Yehuda. Whether we can in the end or not is a whole different story. If you remember, by the way, we learned that when Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with Rabbi Meir, when Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Yossi disagree, we actually hold like Rabbi Yossi. So it's actually not so bad if the Mishnah only matches Rabbi Yossi. Okay, but the Gemara always prefers that when a Mishnah comes without any sort of debate, if they can make it work with everybody, it's better. Okay, but they might not necessarily succeed in doing that. Okay, with that, we'll finish for today. And happy Purim to those who are still celebrating their 3-day Purim. And for those not, so enjoy in Israel, at least it's a day off. And anyway, so have a Shavua Tov to everybody. And we will pick up tomorrow with our Pesachim.